The encrypted message. The rain hammered against the windows of Arlington Hall in Virginia with relentless fury, creating a rhythmic percussion that seemed to mock the silence inside room 2117. It was November 1943, and the war had been grinding on for over 2 years since Pearl Harbor dragged America into the conflict. Inside this nondescript building, hidden behind layers of security and bureaucracy, the Signal Intelligence Service worked tirelessly to break the codes that could turn the tide of war. Margaret Whitmore sat hunched over her desk, her eyes burning from another 14-hour shift. At 26 years old, she was one of the few women cryptanalysts in a world dominated by men who often dismissed her contributions with patronizing smiles. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her reading glasses had slipped down her nose for the 100th time that day. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the mountains of encrypted intercepts that covered every available surface. "Still here, Whitmore?" A voice cut through her concentration. Margaret looked up to see Captain James Morrison standing in the doorway, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. James was 32, a career military man who had been assigned to Arlington Hall after a shrapnel injury in North Africa left him with a permanent limp. His sharp blue eyes and angular features gave him an air of intensity that most people found intimidating, but Margaret had learned to see past that exterior to the brilliant mind underneath. "Could ask you the same thing, Captain," Margaret replied, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Shouldn't you be home with that wife of yours?" James's expression flickered, something painful crossing his features before he masked it. "Dorothy's in New York visiting her sister. I figured I might as well make myself useful here." Margaret knew there was more to it than that. Office gossip suggested the Morrison marriage was crumbling under the weight of war and distance, but she had never pried. Everyone had their private battles, and in these times, those were often harder to fight than the war overseas. "What are you working on?" James asked, limping into the room and pulling up a chair beside her desk. Margaret hesitated. The intercept she'd been studying had arrived 3 days ago from one of their listening posts in Alaska. It was different from the usual German military communications. The encryption was more sophisticated, the pattern more complex. She'd been working on it in her spare time, which technically violated protocol since she hadn't been assigned to this particular message. "It's probably nothing," she said, sliding the papers toward him. "But there's something odd about this transmission. It came through on a frequency we've been monitoring for Japanese diplomatic traffic, but the encryption doesn't match any of their standard codes." James leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. The room fell silent except for the rain and the distant clacking of typewriters from other offices. He studied the papers for several minutes, his finger tracing the columns of numbers and letters that meant nothing to the untrained eye. "You're right," he said finally. "This isn't Japanese. The structure is all wrong. But it's not German either." He looked up at her, and Margaret saw the same excitement in his eyes that she felt. "Where exactly did this come from?" "Alaska, November 17, 2:37 a.m. local time." The operators almost missed it. It was a short burst transmission, less than 30 seconds. James stood abruptly, wincing as his injured leg protested the sudden movement. "We need to bring this to Colonel Harrison." "At 10 o'clock at night?" "Margaret, if this is what I think it might be," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "We can't wait until morning." 20 minutes later, they sat in Colonel Harrison's office, a sparse room decorated only with a map of Europe and a photograph of the colonel with General Marshall. Harrison was 58, a career intelligence officer who had earned his reputation breaking codes during the First World War. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he examined their findings, but Margaret noticed the way his jaw tightened. "You're suggesting this is Soviet?" Harrison asked, his gravelly voice cutting straight to the point. "The patterns match some of the experimental encryption we've seen from NKVD communications," James explained. "But the content, if we're reading this correctly, suggests something unprecedented." Margaret interjected, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Sir, I've been running frequency analysis on the numeric sequences. If I'm right about the substitution cipher they're using, this message contains coordinates. Naval coordinates in the North Atlantic. Harrison set down the papers and fixed them both with a penetrating stare. Our ally is the Soviet Union, in case either of you has forgotten. We're fighting the same enemy. Yes, sir, James replied carefully. But allies don't typically encrypt messages this heavily unless they have something significant to hide. The colonel was silent for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on his wall marking the seconds toward midnight. Outside, the rain had intensified, rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers demanding entry. I'm authorizing you both to work on this exclusively, Harrison said finally. You don't discuss it with anyone else in this building. You don't take notes home. And you report directly to me every 8 hours with your progress. Is that understood? Yes, sir, they answered in unison. As they left Harrison's office and walked back through the dimly lit corridors of Arlington Hall, Margaret felt the weight of what they'd just been assigned. She glanced at James, who was moving more slowly than usual, his limp more pronounced after the long day. You should go home and rest, she said. We can start fresh in the morning. James shook his head. I'll sleep when we figure out what this message means. Besides, Dorothy won't be back until next week. Empty house isn't exactly calling to me. They returned to room 2117, and Margaret made a fresh pot of coffee on the hot plate they kept hidden in the supply closet. The coffee was terrible, made from grounds that had been reused too many times, but it was hot and caffeinated, which was all that mattered. For the next 4 hours, they worked in intense concentration, speaking only to share observations or test theories. Margaret had always worked better in silence, and she appreciated that James seemed to understand this without it needing to be said. He didn't fill the air with unnecessary chatter or try to take credit for her insights the way some of the other male officers did. At 2 in the morning, Margaret's eyes caught something that made her pulse quicken. James, look at this sequence here, and then this one, 16 lines down. He moved behind her chair to see what she was pointing at, and she caught the faint smell of his aftershave mixed with coffee and cigarette smoke. It was oddly comforting in the sterile environment of the code room. It's a repetition, he breathed. That's the break we needed. If the same sequence represents the same word or phrase, we can start building a key. They worked with renewed energy, building their substitution key letter by letter, number by number. The rain outside had stopped, and through the window, Margaret could see the first pale hints of dawn painting the sky. The world was waking up, and somewhere out there, men were dying in battles whose outcomes might hinge on the work being done in this small room. By 6 a.m., they had enough of the message decoded to understand what they were looking at, and the revelation left them both stunned into silence. This can't be right, Margaret whispered, though part of her knew it was. The patterns didn't lie. The mathematics didn't lie. James had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held the decoded message. The Soviets are planning to intercept Allied convoy SC-147. They're going to allow the German U-boats to know its exact position and timing. Why would they do that? Those are supply ships heading to Britain. Medical supplies, ammunition. And intelligence personnel, James finished grimly. Look at the last section. They're specifically interested in ensuring certain Allied intelligence officers don't reach London. Officers who apparently have information about Soviet activities that Stalin doesn't want shared with Churchill and Roosevelt. Margaret stood and walked to the window, watching the sun rise over Virginia. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, ships were steaming toward England, their crews unaware that they'd been marked for sacrifice by the very ally they thought was fighting beside them. And somewhere in Moscow, someone had decided that whatever secrets those ships carried was worth the lives of everyone aboard. We have to tell Harrison immediately, she said. And say what? That our ally is deliberately feeding intelligence to the Nazis to eliminate witnesses to their own war crimes? James shook his head. Margaret, this could shatter the alliance. Without the Soviets tying up the German army on the Eastern Front, we could lose this war. And if we do nothing, those sailors die, and whatever the Soviets are hiding stays hidden. They stared at each other across the room, the weight of the decision crushing down on them. This was beyond code-breaking, beyond military intelligence. This was about choosing between saving lives now and potentially saving the world from Nazi Germany. "We take it to Harrison," James said finally. "We give him the facts, and we let the people who get paid more than us make the impossible decisions." But as Margaret gathered their decoded materials, she couldn't shake the feeling that this message was just the beginning. They'd opened a door into something much larger and more dangerous than either of them had imagined. And once a door like that was opened, it could never truly be closed again. The morning shift was starting to arrive at Arlington Hall, and through the walls, they could hear the sounds of the building coming to life: typewriters, telephones, the low murmur of voices discussing the previous night's radio intercepts. The ordinary machinery of war continued its relentless grinding, while Margaret and James stood at the center of a secret that could change everything. The ethical crossroads. Colonel Harrison's office felt smaller in the stark morning light. He sat behind his desk, the decoded Soviet message spread before him like evidence at a trial. For 10 minutes, he'd been reading and rereading their work while Margaret and James stood at attention, exhausted but too wired with nervous energy to feel it. Finally, Harrison looked up, his weathered face grave. "You're both certain about this translation?" "Yes, sir," Margaret replied. "I've checked it 3 times. Captain Morrison verified my work independently. The message is clear: the Soviets intend to compromise convoy SC-147's position to German intelligence." "And the timeline?" Harrison's voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "The convoy departed Halifax 4 days ago," James said. "Based on their projected route, they'll reach the mid-Atlantic gap in approximately 72 hours. That's where they'll be most vulnerable, beyond the range of land-based air cover." Harrison stood and walked to the map on his wall, his finger tracing the Atlantic shipping lanes. 43 merchant vessels. Escorts include 2 destroyers and a corvette. Approximately 2,000 sailors and passengers. He turned back to face them. "And you believe the Soviets are doing this to eliminate specific intelligence personnel?" "The decoded message specifically mentions eliminating the witness problem," Margaret said. "We believe there are Allied officers aboard who have information about Soviet activities that Stalin wants suppressed." "What kind of activities?" James and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd spent the last hour before dawn following that thread, decoding additional fragments that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. "We think it relates to the Katyn massacre, sir," James said quietly. "The mass execution of Polish officers by the NKVD in 1940. The Soviets have been blaming it on the Germans, but there are witnesses, Polish survivors, Red Cross observers, and Allied intelligence officers who were in the region. Some of those witnesses are apparently on that convoy." The room fell silent. The Katyn massacre had been a source of tension between the Allies and Soviets for months. The Polish government in exile in London insisted the Soviets were responsible, while Stalin vehemently denied it and blamed the Nazis. If proof emerged that the Soviets had murdered thousands of Polish officers from a nation the Allies were ostensibly fighting to liberate, it could fracture the alliance at a critical moment in the war. Harrison sat back down heavily. "I need to make a phone call. You two don't leave this building. Don't talk to anyone. Get some coffee, get some food from the commissary, but stay close." "Understood." "Yes, sir." They left his office and made their way to the commissary in the basement. The smell of scrambled eggs and burnt toast filled the air, mixing with cigarette smoke and the chemical tang of strong coffee. The room was crowded with analysts, translators, and military personnel grabbing breakfast between shifts. Margaret and James found a table in the corner, away from the general chatter. "We did the right thing, bringing this to him," Margaret said, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as James. James stirred his coffee absently, his eyes distant. "Did we? Think about it, Margaret. We've just handed our government information that could force them to make an impossible choice. Do they warn the convoy and risk exposing our intelligence capabilities to the Soviets? Do they let it happen to preserve the alliance? Or do they try something else entirely and potentially make things worse? We're cryptanalysts, not politicians. Our job is to decode the messages, not decide what to do with them. Is it? James leaned forward, lowering his voice. We're not just translating recipes here. Every message we decode, every piece of intelligence we provide, it all has consequences. People live or die based on what we do in that room. Margaret knew he was right. She'd always understood intellectually that their work mattered, but this was the first time she'd felt the crushing weight of that responsibility personally. Those weren't just names on a convoy manifest, they were people with families, dreams, lives that could be snuffed out in the freezing waters of the Atlantic. My brother is in the Navy, she said quietly. Serving on a destroyer in the Pacific. Every night before I go to sleep, I wonder if he's still alive. If his ship has been hit. If he's floating in the water somewhere, hoping for rescue that might never come. She looked at James directly. I decode these messages so that maybe, somewhere, someone else's brother has a better chance of making it home. We can't control what the people above us decide to do with our work. All we can control is doing it right. James nodded slowly. You're right. He paused, struggling with the words. Dorothy and I got married right before I shipped out to North Africa. We barely knew each other, really. Just two people trying to grab some happiness before the world ended. Now I'm back, broken leg and all, and I barely recognize myself. I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore. A husband? A soldier? A guy who reads other people's mail and pretends it doesn't matter. It was the most personal thing James had ever shared with her, and Margaret felt the vulnerability in it. You're someone who's trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. That's all any of us can do. Before James could respond, a young lieutenant approached their table. Captain Morrison, Miss Whitmore. Colonel Harrison wants you back in his office immediately. They abandoned their barely touched breakfast and hurried back upstairs. When they entered Harrison's office, they found him standing with another man, a civilian in an expensive gray suit who looked distinctly out of place in the military building. This is Mr. William Donovan, Harrison said by way of introduction. Office of Strategic Services. Margaret's pulse quickened. The OSS was America's wartime intelligence agency, responsible for espionage and covert operations. If they'd brought in Donovan, this had escalated far beyond a simple decryption assignment. Donovan was a stocky man in his late 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to calculate and assess everything they touched. He shook hands with both of them, his grip firm and businesslike. Colonel Harrison has briefed me on your discovery, Donovan said, getting straight to the point. I've been on the phone with Washington for the past hour. The president has been informed. Sir, what's going to happen to the convoy? Margaret asked, unable to contain the question. Donovan studied her for a moment. That's being decided at levels far above my pay grade, Miss Whitmore. But I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Walk me through the message again, every detail. For the next hour, they went through everything, the initial intercept, the encryption patterns, the decoded content, their analysis of what it meant. Donovan listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed a formidable intelligence. When they finished, Donovan was quiet for a long moment. Here's what I can tell you. This message isn't the only intelligence we have suggesting Soviet duplicity. There have been other incidents, supply shipments diverted, intelligence operations compromised, partisan groups betrayed to the Germans in territories where Soviet and Allied interests don't align. But this is the most concrete evidence we've had. What about the convoy? James pressed. The Navy is scrambling additional escorts and routing long-range patrol aircraft to provide cover, Donovan said. We're changing the convoy's route without officially acknowledging why. The cover story is updated intelligence on German U-boat positions, which isn't entirely untrue, since we now know those U-boats will be hunting for SC-147. But we're not confronting the Soviets? Margaret asked. Donovan's expression hardened. Miss Whitmore, in 6 months, American and British forces will launch the largest amphibious invasion in history at Normandy. To succeed, we need the Soviet army grinding down German divisions on the Eastern Front. If we confront Stalin now, if we fracture this alliance, the Nazis win. Hundreds of thousands more die. Maybe millions. The world falls into darkness for generations. So we just ignore it. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. They tried to get our sailors killed, and we pretend it didn't happen. We acknowledge it happened, Donovan corrected her sharply. We make damn sure it doesn't happen again. And when this war is won, when Hitler is defeated and Berlin is in ruins, then, and only then, do we settle accounts with our temporary friends in Moscow. But right now, the only thing that matters is destroying the Nazi war machine. The brutal pragmatism of it made Margaret feel sick, but she understood the logic. War wasn't about doing what was right, it was about doing what was necessary. Sometimes those things aligned, and sometimes they didn't. There's something else, Donovan continued. We've identified 3 intelligence officers aboard convoy SC-147 who have first-hand knowledge of Katyn. The plan is to quietly remove them from the convoy at our next safe port and transport them to Washington via a different route. They'll be debriefed, and their information will be secured. After the war, it will be used as leverage against the Soviets, James said, understanding immediately. Precisely. Stalin thinks he can eliminate the witnesses and bury the truth. Instead, we're going to preserve that truth and use it to check Soviet ambitions when the time comes. It's not perfect justice, Captain, but it's the best we can manage in this imperfect world. Harrison spoke up for the first time since Donovan's arrival. There's one more thing you both need to understand. This message and everything connected to it is now classified at the highest level. You don't discuss it with each other outside of secure locations. You don't write about it in letters. You don't mention it after the war is over. This secret dies with you, or people die because of you. Is that absolutely clear? Yes, sir, they answered together. As they left Harrison's office for the second time that morning, Margaret felt fundamentally changed. She'd entered this building yesterday as a cryptanalyst doing her small part for the war effort. Now she was a keeper of secrets that could reshape the post-war world. The weight of it was crushing. Coffee? James suggested. Real coffee, not the commissary swill. There's a diner 2 blocks away that's decent. They signed out of the building and walked through the crisp November morning. The rain had cleared, and the sun was shining, which somehow made everything worse. It seemed wrong that the world could look so normal when they'd just learned something so disturbing. The diner was warm and crowded with morning customers, secretaries, government clerks, a few off-duty military personnel. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, poured them coffee and took their order with practiced efficiency. I keep thinking about those sailors, Margaret said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. They're out there right now, not knowing that their own ally tried to sentence them to death. Not knowing that we decoded the message that might save their lives. We can't save everyone, James said quietly. I learned that in North Africa. We took a German position outside Tunis, and there was this kid, couldn't have been more than 18. Dying from a gut shot, crying for his mother. I sat with him because nobody should die alone, not even the enemy. And I thought about how his mother would get a telegram, and how she'd never know that her son spent his last moments being comforted by the man who probably shot him. How do you live with that? You focus on the people you can save. The intelligence we gather here saves lives, Margaret. Maybe not all of them. Maybe not the ones we'd most want to save. But some. And that has to be enough, because the alternative is giving up entirely. Their food arrived, eggs, toast, bacon, and they ate in comfortable silence. Around them, life continued in its ordinary rhythms. Nobody in this diner knew that the two people in the corner booth were carrying secrets that could alter the course of history. They were just another couple of government workers grabbing breakfast. "Can I ask you something personal?" Margaret said finally. James looked up from his eggs. "Sure."